Good evening. Hi, KJ. Hi, KJ. Good evening. Good to see everyone this evening. Roy kind of touched on something that I think about a lot, and that's the logistics of being a follower of Jesus. I think that we don't think much about that, but those men had wives, they had families, they had things to support, and it ain't like Jesus went and found Peter, a single guy with no attachments, and said, "Come follow me." He found a guy that had a business. He was a fisherman. He had boats. He had a wife. He had a family. He had a mother-in-law. We don't think much about it, but the logistics of following Jesus had to be there. He had to somehow. Peter still had to support his family, right? Still had to support. We don't think much about it. I think about it a lot because I know whenever Peter drug his wife with him, right? I mean, she was right there, had to be right there, involved right with him in what he was doing. And, Paul makes some allusion to that, bringing along wives. Some of the others bring along wives, which gives you the indication that a lot of the wives went with them, were involved. Wish we knew more about that because I think it's really, really fascinating and Roy and I think I've had that discussion with him. Peter, I don't know if I could be a Peter. I've asked myself that question a million times in my life. If Jesus showed up at my place where I work and did some miracle and said, just lock the door and leave it, or leave the door open because you ain't coming back and come follow me. That's a lot of faith. You can't deny that. That's even for Peter to see a miracle, but that's still just a tremendous amount of faith to be what he did. And I do wonder how his wife and his family and the people around him reacted to his decision. I'm sure it wasn't easy for him to come to his family, to come to his wife and say, "Listen, I'm going to go follow Jesus, and you need to get on board." I imagine that wasn't an easy conversation. So interesting. I think about that a lot. This evening, we've been talking about prayer in here, and this evening I'm going to kind of left you in a dark place last Wednesday. I'm not going to get a lot better this Wednesday because I'm going to talk to you this evening about stuff with prayer that you probably aren't going to hear much from the pulpit or from people who preach because, we like to have the bright side of life, don't we? But no, life isn't always that way. There's prayers that aren't answered, at least in the way we want them to be answered. And sometimes that's a hard thing. And tonight, I want to look a little bit at Job. I think when we think about prayer, you think about the righteous, you think about God doing things, we often think we want to have that bright side, bright look, and we should. The Bible tells us to pray unwavering, to pray expecting what we want to receive, and I think that's something that we need to do for sure. We're commanded to do that. But when we look at Job, Job's a fascinating study in the Bible anyway, but when you start looking at the prayers of Job, it really is kind of sobering. What Job was going through, what Job was crying out for. Job was a righteous man, the Bible said, a man that was rewarded by God, essentially, or felt like he was rewarded by God. And then, of course, we had this discussion, and I don't want to get into that discussion tonight, something that Job lost everything, right? Job lost everything but a nagging wife, right? That's the only thing God left Job with was a nagging wife. He took everything else away. Couldn't have left him with a good wife, left him with a nagging wife. So it wasn't a Peter wife, right? She was and I think when you look at Job, gives you some perspective. How do we pray when we've lost everything? I don't know anybody in here that's lost what Job lost. Job literally lost everything in a day, right? If you know the story. Lost his children, lost all his children, lost all his wealth, lost all his property. Like I said, the only thing Job was left with was a nagging wife, right? And God took everything else in a day. And, you know, how do you pray when it doesn't change things? You know, I mean, I've prayed really hard for some things in my life for a long time. You know, I mean, there's some prayers I prayed for 20 and 30 years. I feel like I've prayed pretty hard for them, and I haven't seen any change. Just being honest here, right? I mean, just being honest. There's things in my life I've really prayed hard for a long time. Sometimes I pray for things and it seems to get worse. Honestly, you know, seems like things get worse, right? Sometimes I wonder if God hears. You know, I think I'm just being honest. I think we all, you know, if you've been through these things in your life, and almost everybody in here is old enough to have gone through some of these things in your life, these are real things. These are real things. I think as Christians, as followers of God, maybe we want to paint the rosy picture for people, but it's not always rosy for us. It's not always all roses and all wonderful for us. It's not. And sometimes maybe that's one thing bothers me about Christianity, is that I don't think we're honest about it. I think that what we see a lot, what people say, a lot of the things I hear people say that are supposedly faithful Christians bother me, because I just don't think it's honest. And I got to be honest about it. You know, I've been through some you've been through some hard things too, and I don't hold my life up and say, look at how bad I've got it, because I don't. I've got a very blessed, wonderful life. But I've been through some really hard things in my life. And, you know, and I've been through some pretty dark days, and I'm sure you have too. And, you know, how do we pray? How do we pray to God for that? You know, and I talked about that a little bit at the end of class when I talked about laments, you know. A lament is when something happens in your life that cannot be fixed, things that break that you cannot fix. That's a lament. That's when you just cry out to God because you can't fix it. Nobody can fix it, you know. And when you do that, that's lament. That's crying out to God because you don't, nobody else will listen to you. How do we pray? You know, Job is an example of that. Job is an example of somebody who literally lost everything in a day. And you know, Job, the story of Job is very unique because, you know, Job was a very blessed man. He had a lot to lose. He wasn't somebody that didn't have a lot to lose. Job had a lot to lose, right? He was extremely wealthy. He had children. He had flocks. He had land. He had a lot of things to lose. So when Job loses all this, it's really a big thing. And so Job, but the amazing thing in Job 1:20 is what Job did when all these things happened. Job, it says, Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and worshiped. You know, I might have a lot of responses if I lost everything, but I'm not sure that's my response. I mean, I'm just being honest about it. I'm not 100% sure that's the response of Rex, would be to fall on my ground and worship God when I lose everything. But Job, and the amazing thing is Job's statement, because we associate evil with a lot of things. So we associate bad things happening to us with a lot of things. We wonder sometimes, what did I do wrong, right? Why are you punishing me? You know, what did I do wrong? How did I fail? What did I do? We want to blame Satan. We want to blame evil in the world and you know, I think we need to blame, don't we? When bad things happen, we're looking for blame. We're looking for someone to say, why? You know, give me an answer. Job made this amazing statement. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. You know, Job understood that everything in this life that we can lose came from God. You ever thought about that? You don't own a thing, right? You don't own a thing in this world. You don't own a single thing. You're borrowing it. You're borrowing. Everything you have, you're borrowing it. You don't own a thing. You could say, well, my name's on the deed to my house. Well, if you died tomorrow, somebody else's name would be on that deed, right? Name's on the title to my car. So, you know, you don't own a thing. Everything you possess in this world came from God. Everything. You're just using it. And that gives you always gives me a perspective. And Job had that perspective. He understood that every blessing, everything he had been given to him by God. And then if God wanted to take all that away, because Job never blames Satan, Job never blames himself, Job never blames anything here. Job's real straightforward about this. He says God gave it and God took it away. It's real straightforward about it. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You know, Job had this amazing understanding that we struggle with because we somehow think we possess things. And you just don't. And I don't. And I think when we really understand that, it changes how we look at the world. Job, it's just amazing how Job looked at this, you know, and when you think, and so Job tears his robe, he shaves his head. To worship here, shakal, this is shakal in the Hebrew, and it's the same word we use for worship in the New Testament, proskuneo, it's that same word. Literally means he fell with his face to the ground and worshiped God. That's what he did. That idea of worship here is humility, humble himself before God, which is what Job did. But Job, moving through the book of Job, I'm not going to bore you with the whole book of Job because those friend things, that friend discourse gets pretty long if you've ever read Job from front to back. But Job in 16, listen to what he says. He says, I've sewed sackcloth over my skin and thrust my horn in the dust. My face is flushed from weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. You know, Job, when he gets to this point, he says, I have done all these things. I have humbled myself before God. That's the idea of sewed sackcloth over my skin and thrust my horn in the dust. That's it, that very idea of humbled myself before God, right? I've wept. My face is flushed from weeping. Darkness is on my eyelids. Not sleeping, right? I'm not sleeping. I'm weeping. I've humbled myself before God. I've done nothing wrong, right? And my prayer, Job says, my prayer is pure. You know, why are you not responding to me? Is really what Job's saying here. Why are you not responding to what I'm saying? Because here I am. I've humbled myself before you. And yet still you have not responded to me. You have not responded to me. You know, Job at this point, Job's in physical pain, right? Job's got boils on him. He's sitting in this place. He's scraping himself with the pieces of pottery. Job's in physical pain here. It's not just that he's lost everything. Job is in physical pain. And Job's friends are blaming him. Right? Job's friends idea is you did something wrong. You failed. You did something wrong. God is punishing you because you've done something horrendously wrong that you won't tell us what it is. And Job says, I haven't done anything wrong. My prayer is pure. I've humbled myself before you. And Job's friends, and Job is thinking, if this is the case, then why hasn't God heard you? Why is all this happening to you? Why hasn't God heard you? Why hasn't he fixed this? Why hasn't he made this better? We think the same thing sometimes. God had an issue with them, just throwing that out there. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting. Right. It's a really interesting story, and I've skipped a lot, but you can read that if you want to. But yeah, Job's friends came, sat with him for 7 days, and then basically they started asking him, what did you do? And they all had these long discourses of going on, and Job responded. Job basically said, I haven't done anything, and why are you pointing your finger at me? But then again, it's cause and effect, right? This is centuries ago, and it's cause and effect. If this happened to you, then God had to see. That's Old Testament cause and effect, and we lose that in the New Testament, which kind of disturbs me. But in the Old Testament, it was kind of simple. You messed up, man messed up, God punished. That was kind of how that worked in the Old Testament. That's how they thought about it. You messed up, God punished you to the third and fourth generation, right? He told Moses, I'll punish you to the third and fourth generation. And that was the thought. And even in Jesus' time, that was the thought. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that this man would be born blind? Well, it was kind of biblical too, to an extent, as a nation. But I don't know that God ever said, Brent, I'm going to get you because... But as far as like Israel and stuff, absolutely. You fail me, and there's going to be a retribution. There's going to be a punishment. Well, they kind of thought that at that point. But that's one of the fascinating stories about the rich man and Lazarus, in a Jewish thought, when those two men were alive, Lazarus was the one, he'd done something. I mean, he's poor, he's diseased. Lazarus was a sinner. The rich man who had the fine robes and ate at the big table, God was blessing him. He was a righteous guy because look at how God had blessed him. You're the righteous man because you got all this stuff and you've got this nice house and you eat. You're the righteous. This poor guy sitting out here, the dog's licking his sores. He done something bad. I mean, he's obviously a terrible sinner because look at his position in life. Look at his state in life. God's punishing him. We don't talk much because in our mind, we don't see that in that story. But when Jesus was talking to them Jews, that was 100% backwards of what a Jew would have thought. And you're saying this rich man who was blessed and had all this stuff, he's going to punishment, and this poor man who was at the gate, that obviously God was punishing because he had to have some terrible sin in his life, this man goes to the bosom of Abraham. To a Jew, that would make zero sense. Because in their thought, blessings in this life, wealth, health, prosperity, were because you were right with God. I mean, that was how it worked. So when you read that story, to us, we're thinking, oh, well, this poor man. But to a Jew, to Jesus, when talking to those Jews, when Jesus gave them this story, the Jews are like, oh, this is all messed up. This other rich guy should have been in Abraham's bosom. He's blessed. And this other guy who wasn't blessed, but what did Jesus say? He said, in this life, you received your blessings, right? And he didn't. You see? Which is kind of Jewish thought too, because they're thinking, I got blessed in this life, but then Jesus is saying, listen, you need to look beyond this life, right? You need to look beyond this life. So in Job 24, he says, the groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help, but God charges no one with wrongdoing. And I'm kind of throwing this at you out of Job because so many times we really look at the first chapter of Job and we really don't look at the rest of the book of Job. We really look at that first part, and then we get into all these discourses, and I'm kind of picking some stuff out that kind of shows you that Job was questioning God, right? Even this faithful Job who tore his robes and fell on his face, he's still questioning God, right? Why are you doing that? And what's Job's wife saying? She says, curse God and die, right? Curse God and die. And in all this, yet Job did not curse God. He didn't curse him, but he questioned him, right? I think that kind of goes kind of what Brent was saying on his sermon Sunday before last, Job was questioning God here. Why? Why do you do that? We do it. Have you not ever questioned God? Have you never in your life questioned God? Why do these evil people prosper, and these people that are bad prosper, and these people that are good? Have you never questioned God in your life? I have. Have you never questioned God, or why people on drugs with 4 different husbands can have babies, and good Christian people who want to have children are barren? You ever question God? I do. I'm just being honest. I absolutely do. I question God about a lot of things. I question God all the time. But I'm a believer. I'm as good a believer as anybody here, and I think I've got as much faith as anybody that I know. But I still question God. Don't you? I do. Because life isn't fair. Is it? Is life fair? It's not fair. It's not. I don't know how else to say it. And sure I do. But in all of this, I see such great faith. Questioning God's not a lack of faith. I think questioning God is faith. I think that's what God expects. We're seekers, right? Searchers, looking for answers. We're searching to see God in a very evil world. That's it. The duration. I think right off, Job, if God would have snuffed Job out at the end of chapter 1, I think Job would have been fine with it. You know what I mean? But then this goes on, right? This suffering, this pain, this questioning. And by the 21st chapter, Job says, they spend their days in prosperity, and suddenly they go down to Sheol. They say to God, but apart from us, we do not even desire the knowledge of your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what would we gain if we entreat him? Job's idea here is look at some of these people, how they live, and yet, they do well. And yet look at me, right? Look at us, right? What would we gain if we entreat him, Job says. In Job 30, it says, I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. I think when you start to see the despair of Job as this goes on, life is, there's a few things I know. There ain't a lot, so don't ask me a lot of questions. There's a couple of things I know about people, about humanity, and about life. One of those things is we can do a lot if there's hope. You can survive a lot if there's hope. Do you know that? If you think there's hope at the end of it, if you think there's a way out, you can survive a lot because you believe that there's hope. Hope makes us do tremendous things. I always remember the story of this coal miner. I've used it in a sermon, but I haven't used it in a long time because I don't like wearing out stories. But I always remember the story of this coal miner that was trapped in this mine. And the mine had caved in. He was all by himself. Eventually his light went out. You all know the story. He was in the dark. He was digging, trying to find his way out, right? And when they found him, he died. I always said this isn't a happy story. He died. And when they found him, he was 10 inches away from breaking through to the air. 10 inches. His hands were bloody. His fingernails were ripped off. He had dug. But I promise you, as bad as that guy was off, as bad as his hands were and as everything else that was gone with him, I promise you, if somebody could have whispered in that guy's ear 10 more inches, he would have made it. You know what I'm saying? But when you get to that point where you don't have any hope, you quit. That's one of the worst days of your life, is when you quit. I remember my sister had cancer, And we knew it was bad. We knew the doctor said it was bad and all that stuff. And she's gonna try this chemo, right? This cobalt chemo, which is one of the strongest chemos there is. And so she was gonna try this chemo. So she went, she had this chemo, and then like a week later, she goes back to the doctor, and he's like, well, besides for destroying your health, which is what this chemo did, he says, your cancer's grown. It didn't make any difference. There's nothing we can do. And that was when my sister called me that day, and she said, I'm done. There's no hope. I'm done. That was one of the worst days of my life. As long as I thought there was a glimmer of hope, there was a glimmer of hope, I could deal with that. I could pray for that. You know what I'm saying? But when there was no hope, how do you pray? Right? How do you pray at that point when there's no hope? You see? We all know God can do anything. There's no doubt in my mind. God can do anything. God can heal anybody. I just know, not a doubt in my mind, God can do that. I don't doubt that at all. But in my experience of my life is, I've never seen him do that. Right? When somebody's at that point, I've never seen God in my life, in my experience, my personal experiences. And I know God can do it. I have no doubt in my mind God can do it. I believe God can move any mountain. But in the experience of my life, when somebody gets to that point, I've never seen God reach down and touch them and bring them back to their health. Never saw that in my life. Doesn't mean I don't believe God can do it, but that's not my experience. Right? And people say, well, Rex, you don't have any faith. Well, I have absolute faith. I have total faith. But in my experience, I've never saw that happen. You see what I'm saying? And people say, well, you can't fit those two things together in the same sentence. I say, well, I think you have to. I think, because how do you pray when that's gone? I was at Tom's McDonald's house, and Vicki was there, and Tom said, well, I went up there and I told him I wasn't going to do anything else. I'm done. I just want to go home. I just want to go home. I understand that. Vicki's in tears, because when you tell, there's two things going on when you give up. When you resign yourself to that, there's two things. There's two dynamics. There's your dynamic, and you might be totally okay with that. Maybe that's where you're at, and I understand that. I understand that. But it's different on your family when you say that. When you tell your family, I'm done, that's different. How do you pray? We talk about it, and we should pray, and I want to pray, and I want to pray with Tom. And I was over there this afternoon, and I prayed with Tom. But what's your prayer at that point? Realistically, what's your prayer then when you don't expect it? You know God can do it. Don't get me wrong. Don't take what I'm saying out of context, but you don't expect it because you never saw it. I never have, and I don't expect that to happen. Realistically, am I all right here? Are y'all understanding what I'm saying here? Yeah. Yeah, I think, that's what we do. We pray for strength. We pray for peace. We pray for comfort, pray for acceptance. We pray for the family. I think that's the things that you do. I think that's kind of the shift of your prayer, shift of your focus becomes, maybe we would say palliative care, right? But maybe palliative prayer, where we get to that point that we kind of shift that focus a little bit, shift that idea. There was something that happened one time, and I'm going to be generic because these people are still alive. There was a situation that happened several years ago where a young man was tragically killed. This isn't my young man, not my family. Where a young man was tragically killed. people who had great faith. I thought people who had unshakable faith. Young man was killed tragically. Bad deal. I mean, bad deal. Drinking, bad deal. And they lost their faith. And they're people who had such a blessed life, nothing wrong in their life except this. And the statement that was made to me many years ago that I can never get out of my head, the statement that was made to me was that they blamed God because they said if he would have been sick or if he would have survived what happened and went to a hospital and they could have prayed for him to get better, they would have been okay with it. But since he just was killed in an instant and they never had a chance to pray for him, they thought God cheated them because God never gave them a chance to pray for him. And it ruined their faith. I thought about that a lot. Rolled it around in my little mind, thought about it. And you know what my conclusion was? My conclusion is that they had that boy's whole life to pray for him. And when I talk about prayer in here, and I talk about my children, and I talk about Chris, who we lost, I should have prayed harder for him while he was alive. And so when I talk about praying every day, praying the things that are precious to you, right? The things that are precious to you, you should be praying about that every day. Because you don't know what's going to happen. And I think when we fail to do that, my one regret, more than any other regret I have with Chris dying, is I didn't pray for him more. I was aggravated at him. I'll be honest. I was kind of aggravated at him. I was a little disappointed in him. When things were going on, I knew. And instead of buckling down and praying harder and being better, I didn't. And, you've got to pray for people when you can. You got to give your flowers to the living. You got to pray for those things that are important to you, and you got to pray about those things every day. Job was in that situation. But if you really look at the first part of Job, I want you to think about Job's relationship with his family before tragedy struck. Read the first chapter of Job. Job said he made sacrifices for his children, for perhaps they had sinned. Do you ever see that part of Job? In the first part of Job? Job says, he made sacrifices for his kids, for perhaps, right? I think one reason Job was able to let his children go and not was because Job knew that he had done everything godly that he could do for his kids. You know what I'm saying? Job knew that he had done everything godly he could do. He held his kids up. He made sacrifices for his kids. He did everything he could for his kids. Job prayed. He never stopped praying. Job questioned God. Job wanted answers he couldn't get. Job saw the injustice of his position and the things that had happened to him. And I've showed you some of the prayers of Job. Nobody's probably going to ever show you, because that's not a side of Job that people want you to see. Right? But the amazing thing about it is that's the side of Job you need to see, because in all these things, Job never quit praying. Job never quit. Even though Job really didn't even know what to say, Job really didn't even know what to ask for at that point. Job knew things that happened in his life that could never be fixed. Job never quit praying. Job never abandoned his faith. Job never gave up on God. Even though Job thought God might have given up on Job, Job never gave up on God, ever. Because in Job's misery and Job's despair and all these things that had happened, Job understood that God was the only one who could do anything about it. God was the only one that could help. God was the only one that could really understand what was going on. He overwhelms Job. God overwhelmed Job with his power and majesty, but even when Job asked those questions, God didn't answer Job. God didn't explain himself to Job. God didn't try to explain the evil in the world. God didn't try to explain the terrible things that had happened. God didn't try to explain any of that. You know what God said to Job? Job says, "Where were you when I made the world?" You know, we can't understand God. We cannot understand the things that God does within our lives. We cannot understand those things because it's too high for us. That's why you have to have faith, because God knows. I don't. I don't understand things in this world. I don't understand why bad things happen to good people. I don't understand those type of tragedies. I don't know why little kids get cancer, and I don't know why babies die, and I don't know these things. I mean, you know, people look at us, look at Christians like we should have the answers. Sometimes the answer is, I really don't know. But I know God. And I have faith that God had worked this out. And I believe that God's knowledge is way more than Rex's will ever be. I believe that. God looked at Job and he says, "Why do you question me? Where were you when I made the world? Where were you when I set the earth on its pillars and on its foundation? Where were you, Job? You can't understand, but you can understand me." So why pray? Job's experience and ours, if we are honest, shatters the easy answers of his friends, doesn't it? It shatters the shallow views of prayer around today. It really does. It tears them down. Prayer is all about relationship. You know what relationship is? Relationship is honesty. Would you agree with that? You cannot have a valid relationship with anyone if you're not honest with them. Would you agree with that? Don't you think you need to be honest with God? Job was honest with God, wasn't he? Job was 100% honest with God when he said, "Where were you? Why don't you hear me? Why do good things happen to bad people?" Job was honest. We need to be honest when we pray with God. It's relationship. That relationship is not always sweetness and light for us. Sometimes it's bitterness and suffering. And yet, like Job, we persist in prayer because we trust God, even when, especially when, we do not understand. Questioning God's wisdom can lead to a deeper faith. That's not my quote. Questioning God's wisdom can lead to a deeper faith. You know, prayer is, what's the psalmist say? "When I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive, till I entered the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their final destiny." You know, I don't think there's things that you and we're not going to understand some things in this life. I'm just telling you. There's things that are going to happen to us here that we're not going to understand. But we have to have faith in a God that does understand. You have to rely on His wisdom, His knowledge, His majesty, His glory, His sovereignty. Because those things are probably too lofty for me to understand. So I think tonight, as we went through this, I hope that you think about those prayers when maybe you really don't even know what to pray for. I hope you think about the prayers of, maybe I'll call them the prayers of desperation, the prayers of hopelessness. I don't know. You put your word on it. I don't know the right answer. But I hope that you think a little bit that prayer is not always light and easy and wonderful, and sometimes prayer is difficult and it's hard and it's heart-wrenching, and sometimes at the end of it, maybe we still don't have the answers we seek, but maybe we But if we pray, we trust in a God who has the answers. And sometimes we have to look to that. Look beyond my understanding, my knowledge, my thought of what God's supposed to do. I've learned a long time ago, God doesn't need Rex's help. I mean, sometimes I want to give it to him. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes I want to give God a little help. I want to tell him what I want, tell him how to do it, tell him how it ought to work out. But I learned a long time ago, God doesn't need Rex's help. I think God looks at me sometimes when I try to help him and he says, Rex, where were you when I created all of this? I've got it. I build it. I control it. I own it. I got it. Right? And that's great faith. Anyway, maybe a little lighter next week, but hopefully something to think about. Thanks for your attention.